On a windy Monday in March 2024, the gravel lot at Prairie Valley Cooperative filled with polished pickups, dealer logos, and men in clean insulated jackets. Then Dale Caldwell rolled in behind them in a 1989 Chevrolet Silverado with 318,000 miles, rust spread along both fenders, and a tailgate tied shut with baling twine that had faded from blue to gray. Her coveralls were patched at both knees, her coat zipper had been replaced with a brass keyring, and her boots looked older than some of the younger growers at the meeting. She parked at the edge, near the propane cage, and carried in a legal pad that had coffee stains on the bottom corner. Two men at the coffee urn glanced over, saw the truck, and said quietly that she was probably one breakdown from quitting. Calvin Rusk, the equipment dealer with a new 3/4-ton diesel and a pressed black vest stitched with his company name, watched her enter and gave the kind of smile people use when they think a decision has already been made for them. Dale did not answer the smiles, the whispers, or the sideways looks. She wrote one number on her pad before she sat down. $141.75 per acre. That was her projected spring machinery repair reserve, and she had already funded it in January. Most people in Adams County had known Dale long enough to assume they understood her, and short enough to be wrong. They knew she lived in the same two-bedroom farmhouse outside Hastings, bought in 1986 for $62,000. They knew the shingles had been replaced once in 2009 for $8,440, and the porch still leaned a little to the east. They knew she never traded vehicles and never carried a phone newer than necessary. What they did not know was that she had kept every receipt in dated envelopes since 1984, seed invoices, diesel slips, twine bundles, planter chains, tire patches, veterinary calls, county land taxes, and hand-scrawled notes from local welders paid in cash. If you stacked all 40 years, the paper stood over 6 feet high in banker boxes. Her methods looked like habit. They were actually a system. Dale was 26 in the spring of 1984, renting 240 acres and sleeping 4 hours a night through planting season. Her father had lost their family operation in the 1980s rate shock, not because he was careless, but because he carried variable debt when interest climbed past 19%. She remembered the farm auction in exact fragments, a yellow sticker on the grain auger, her mother folding her hands under the table so nobody would see them shake, a neighbor bidding on their feed wagon because he needed one too. No villain stood at that auction, just arithmetic. After that day, Dale wrote a single rule on the inside cover of a church bulletin and kept it in her wallet for 20 years. Debt can buy time, but it can also sell your mornings to someone else. From 1984 through 1986, she ran a strict cash ladder. Year 1, she grossed $96,300 on corn and soybeans from rented ground, spent $71,820 on inputs, fuel, rent, and repairs, and retained $24,480 before personal costs. She lived on $14,200, saved $10,280, and added $6,000 from winter bookkeeping work for 2 neighboring farms. Year 2, better weather and tighter costs lifted retained farm earnings to $31,960, and she saved $22,600 total by keeping her household expenses at $15,360. Year 3, she retained $39,740 from farm operations, added $8,100 from custom baling, and reached $66,440 in liquid savings. She bought the farmhouse for $62,000 cash and paid $3,420 in closing costs and transfer taxes. No mortgage, no note. One account balance dropped near zero on purpose. She expanded slowly, and every step had a cost ceiling before it had a dream attached to it. In 1988, she leased another 180 acres at $72 per acre when neighbors were paying $85 to lock in scale. In 1990, she purchased a used row crop tractor at auction for $19,800 and spent $2,140 in parts over 2 years, rather than finance a new unit at an advertised 9.2%. In 1991, she bought a 1978 Combine for $18,500 cash, then tracked every repair in a yellow envelope marked Harvest Iron. Feeder chain, $760, clean grain elevator paddles, $310, belts and bearings, $1,980, gearbox rebuild reserve, $4,500. She still remembers that envelope because it taught her the difference between planned maintenance and panic buying. The last machinery note she ever carried was retired in 1993. Principal balance, $11,740. Interest rate, 7.1%. She paid it 6 months early. By then, she had a pattern that never left her. If projected debt service on any purchase exceeded 15% of a conservative yield scenario, she did not buy it. Conservative, in Dale's books, meant using a 10-year average yield reduced by 10% and a price reduced by 15%. If the deal did not survive those assumptions, it was not a deal. By 1998, she had enough retained earnings and savings to buy 160 acres for $1,050 per acre, total $168,000, paid with one cashier check and no lien. In 2003, she entered a land contract on another tract but structured it with accelerated principal, then closed the final payment in 2007. Since that year, no land note. Her discipline was visible if you knew what to look for. She wrote repair dates on masking tape and stuck them above the workbench. She bought hydraulic hose in bulk and cut it to fit instead of paying emergency markup during planting windows. She changed engine oil by clock hours, not by convenience. She kept 2 sets of planter meters rebuilt and ready, one in service and one wrapped in oiled paper. On paper, those choices looked small. $480 saved here, $1,240 there, $3,900 avoided on rushed dealer labor. Over 40 years, those small choices compounded into retained earnings that averaged $118,000 per year. Multiply that by 4 decades, and you get $4.72 million before land appreciation, patronage equity, and treasury yield. Quiet money, durable money. By the second week of April 2024, while many operations were still waiting on financing committees, Dale had prepaid seed, chemical, and a portion of nitrogen, using supplier discount windows that trimmed her input bill by 4.8%, compared with posted spring terms. She had done similar things for years. In 2020, prepaying fertilizer saved $23,700 when the market tightened later. In 2016, she upgraded grain bins for $84,300 cash after 2 harvest seasons of setting aside bin reserves at $37 per acre. In 2023, she spent $41,260 on machinery repairs and downtime support. Local estimates for replacing her core equipment package pointed to annual depreciation and finance costs near $189,000. She knew those numbers because she asked for written quotes and filed them right beside her own invoices. Her personal budget was just as deliberate. Annual living expense target, $21,400. Property insurance and utilities averaged $7,860. Groceries and household supplies, $6,540. Health and out-of-pocket care, $3,200. Clothing, $640. Church, local giving, and family travel, $2,160. Miscellaneous, $1,000. Some years ran higher, some lower. The 5-year average stayed near plan because she treated personal spending the same way she treated field operations. Budget first, emotion second. The same old Silverado that made people wince had another purpose, too. No truck payment meant no monthly pressure to sell grain at weak prices just to cover fixed cash outflow. People laughed at the twine on the tailgate. Dale called it optionality. At the cooperative meeting, Calvin Rusk began his presentation with bright slides and a headline about modern margins, then drifted into comments about reliability, scale, and who was prepared for the next decade. He did not say Dale's name at first. He did not need to. Several heads turned toward her anyway. She kept writing in that coffee-stained legal pad. Projected fuel use, estimated labor hours, parts risked by machine age, and one line underlined twice, cash is the crop too. When the meeting ended, Calvin stepped down from the front row and moved toward her, with the confidence of a man accustomed to urgent signatures. Dale closed her pad, stood, and looked out the door toward her rusted truck in the long spring ahead, already deciding that the next argument would be settled with numbers, paper, and no raised voice at all. Calvin Rusk caught up to Dale just outside the cooperative door, where the wind shoved seed catalog pages across the concrete, and the smell of diesel drifted from idling pickups. His boots were clean, his vest still pressed, his truck key fob hanging from one finger like a sales prop. He walked beside her as she crossed the lot toward the Silverado with the twine-tied tailgate, speaking loudly enough that 3 growers near the bulk oil tank could hear every word. He laid out the package in practice sequence. 1 late-model combine, 1 high-speed planter, 1 row crop tractor, total purchase price $612,400, 10% down, variable rate 8.4%, 7-year amortization. Projected annual payment $96,870 before insurance and service plan. He framed the offer as rescue, then framed refusal as risk. He told her spring windows were too narrow for old iron, told her downtime would erase margins, told her cash buyers were too small to survive modern volatility. Dale listened with one hand on her truck door and said only, "Write me the full cost by year." Calvin smiled at that, as if the request confirmed she did not understand how modern equipment deals worked. He handed her a glossy sheet with monthly payment estimates and a line about tax-efficient leverage, then added a final push in front of witnesses. You can either grow now or get left behind. Before the week was out, people repeated his line at the parts counter and the diner and the church basement after Wednesday's supper. If you want to know how a county decides who is prudent and who is failing, watch whose numbers get repeated when coffee is hot and planting weather is late. By Thursday, the talk had hardened into prediction. Calvin said she would sign before planning was done, and men at the diner repeated it as if the contract were already inked, because in Adams County, reputation often moved faster than arithmetic, and public certainty could corner a person before a single field was planted. Dale drove home without turning on the radio, the Silverado rattling at 48 miles per hour on county gravel, and set Calvin's sheet on the passenger seat beside her own legal pad. At the farmhouse, she spread both documents on the oak table that still carried a burn mark from a 1997 pressure canner lid. Then she wrote one comparison line. Proposed annual equipment payment, $96,870 versus her 10-year average total machinery repair and maintenance cost, $44,160. Under it, she wrote a second line. Fixed payment due in low-price years, $96,870 versus variable repairs she could defer or stage. Then she wrote the line that mattered most to her, the line she had trusted since she was 26. Mandatory payments remove choices. The reason she did not flinch under public pressure was built long before Calvin had a dealership logo on his vest. In 1984, when she started on rented ground, she had two assets that never showed up on a lender brochure: a fear of losing mornings to creditors and a memory that would not fade. She had watched her father try to outwork a variable note as rates climbed. He did not drink. He did not gamble. He did not waste money. He signed loans that made sense at one rate and failed at another. At the auction, she saw good neighbors buying tools they needed from a family they cared about, all of them ashamed of a mathematics nobody in that yard controlled. Afterward, an older producer named Harold Vetter gave her 10 minutes behind the machine shed and one sentence she kept for 40 years. If your lender can call your note faster than rain can save your crop, you do not own your farm. Harold rented her 80 acres in 1985 at $69 per acre, when others asked $78, and when she came short one fall because of hail loss, he said, "Pay me when you can," then waited 6 months without penalty. He died in 1999. She still kept his handwritten rent receipts in a separate envelope with his name and the date of his funeral. Her no-debt philosophy was never ideology for its own sake. It was operational design. She separated costs into 3 columns long before spreadsheets became common at co-op meetings: unavoidable, controllable, and optional. Land tax was unavoidable. Seed population rates were controllable. New paint was optional. In 1987, she tested the system on paper across 3 yield scenarios. At 142 bushels per acre, corn, and $2.21 cash price, she survived with modest retained earnings if machinery repairs stayed below $52 per acre. At 128 bushels and $1.94, she still stayed positive if she deferred non-critical upgrades. At 118 bushels and $1.78, she broke even only by reducing discretionary expense to near zero and carrying no installment debt. That third column changed her life. She stopped asking whether she could afford a payment in good years and started asking whether she could survive it in bad years. The shift looked old-fashioned to others. It was actually stress testing. By 1992, she had saved enough to buy a used field cultivator and grain drill package for $7,400 total, then spent $860 replacing bearings and openers instead of financing new units at dealer terms that would have cost more than $15,000 over 5 years. In 1994, she negotiated cash diesel purchases with a local distributor, paying within 10 days for a 2-point discount that averaged $0.037 per gallon across 11,800 gallons that season. Small savings that compounded into $436 and then into next year's seed reserve. In 1996, she opened a treasury ladder with $40,000 from retained earnings and rolled maturities at 6-month intervals, not for excitement, but for liquidity discipline. By 2006, that ladder and cooperative patronage equity gave her a reliable cushion when weather cut yields. She wrote every move down, filed every invoice by month, and reconciled every envelope against the county tax statement and grain settlement sheets. She never called it wealth building. She called it keeping score against risk. 3 days after Calvin's lot-side pitch, she had to prove whether the system still worked under pressure. The gearbox on the 1978 Combine failed during preseason inspection, and replacement nitrogen quotes came in at $1,090 per ton after another market jump. Most producers who heard those two facts in 1 week expected an urgent loan renewal. Dale parked the Combine by the machine shed, tagged the failed assembly with red tape, and called 2 salvage yards, one in Kearney and one near Grand Island. She found a compatible rebuilt unit for $6,800, plus $420 freight, compared with $14,600 for a dealer replacement. She approved the order, wrote the check, and pulled the harvest reserve envelope to verify the balance. Then she lifted 19 banker boxes from the spare room closet, carried them into the kitchen one by one, and stacked them around the oak table in a ring of paper and years. Each box had a range on the side in black marker: 1984 to 1987, 1988 to 1991, forward to 2024. She opened them and began laying receipts in rows by category, while wind pushed against the old farmhouse windows. Her process was exact and public by intention. She made 6 columns across the table: land, inputs, machinery, labor, household, taxes. She added a 7th for interest expense and left it nearly blank after 1993. That blank space was the point. She called the co-op manager, then the county extension educator, and invited both to see her 5-year cost matrix once it was complete. She did not ask for endorsement. She asked for witness. The matrix used her own numbers and conservative yields, then compared them with county averages from extension reports. Over 5 crop years, her weighted production cost came to $3.38 per bushel, including repairs, storage, labor allocation, and overhead. The county blended average, heavy with financed depreciation and interest, stood at $4.97. On 182 bushel corn, that difference meant $289.38 per acre of cushion before marketing decisions. Over 1,140 farmed acres, the annual operating resilience spread was $329,893.20. When corn dropped from $6.82 to $4.21, cushion became survival. By the end of April 2024, she had also prepared the year-sequenced ledger she would later carry to the mediation table. 1986, farmhouse purchase, $62,000 cash, closing costs $3,420. 1993, final machinery note retired, balance $11,740, rate 7.1%, paid 6 months early. 1998, 160 acres bought at $1,050 per acre, total $168,000 cash. 2007, last land contract paid in full. 2016, grain bin upgrade, $84,300 cash from dedicated reserve. 2020, fertilizer prepay discount, savings $23,700. 2023, machinery repairs $41,260 versus estimated annual depreciation and finance burden on new package near $189,000. She included one more line that people in the county had never guessed from her truck and patched coat: liquid reserves, treasury bills, and cash equivalents, $1,940,000 as of March statement date. She put source documents behind each line and numbered every page. That first kitchen table night ran long. She ate tomato soup at 11, standing up, then kept sorting receipts until the clock on the stove turned past 1. The old oak table disappeared under 40 years of paper, and the pattern that neighbors called luck became visible, even to people who disagreed with her. Controlled living costs near $21,400 a year, no equipment debt since 1993, no land note since 2007, retained earnings averaging $118,000 through commodity highs and lows, and choices preserved because fixed obligations were kept low. She was not preparing a speech. She was preparing evidence. Outside, the Silverado sat by the porch with rust along both fenders and baling twine on the tailgate, looking exactly like the truck of someone barely holding on. Inside, under a single kitchen light, Dale Caldwell built the ledger that would soon force Adams County to recalculate what solvency looked like. At 6:10 the next morning, the kitchen light was still on when cooperative manager Wes Hallbrook and extension educator Naomi Laird stepped through Dale Caldwell's back door, set their clipboards down, and stopped talking. 19 banker boxes ringed the oak table. Receipts lay in careful rows, each held flat by socket wrenches, seed sample tins, and a cast-iron skillet lid she used as a paperweight. Dale did not start with philosophy. She started with sequence. She handed Wes a stapled packet labeled 1984 through 1993 and gave Naomi the second packet labeled 1994 through 2007. Then she kept the third stack, 2008 through 2024, in front of her right hand. "Check any line," she said. "Source is behind it." Wes pulled one invoice at random, diesel delivery from October 1994, then matched it to her ledger line. Naomi checked a county tax stub from 2007 against the principal payoff she had listed in red ink. Both matched to the dollar. Dale's progression was not a mystery once the arithmetic sat in daylight. It was a long chain of decisions made under ceilings. In 1984, she retained $24,480. In 1985, $31,960. In 1986, $39,740, then spent $62,000 on the farmhouse and $3,420 closing, leaving $800 in checking and a paid deed in the file cabinet. In 1987, she retained $28,110 and set $12,000 aside as her first machinery reserve envelope. In 1988, she retained $34,900 while adding 180 leased acres at $72 per acre, then allocated $9,600 to taxes due the following year, so no bill would ever force a rushed grain sale. In 1989, a wet spring cut yields. Retained earnings dropped to $19,300, and she still finished the year positive because her fixed obligations stayed low. That year paid for this habit, she told them, tapping the envelope marked Reserve First. She moved into the 1990s pages and kept the pace steady. 1990, used tractor at $19,800 cash. Annual retained earnings, $41,250 after repairs. 1991, bought the 1978 Combine for $18,500. Retained $37,420 after building a $4,500 gearbox reserve. 1992, cultivator and drill package for $7,400 plus $860 parts. Retained $44,070. 1993, retired final machinery note $11,740 balance at 7.1%, paid 6 months early. Annual interest expense thereafter on equipment debt, zero. 1994, diesel discount purchases saved $436.60 and were rolled into input prepay. 1995 retained $53,880 and opened a separate land fund account with $30,000. 1996, first Treasury ladder rung at $40,000 in 6-month bills, then another $25,000 at 12 months. 1997, retained $61,300 despite storm loss because she deferred non-critical shop expansion. 1998, bought 160 acres at $1,050 per acre, total $168,000 cash. Then ended the year with no machinery debt and $22,400 in liquid reserves. By the first week of May 2024, after 6 mornings of cross-checking, Wes and Naomi had initialed every decade packet and asked Dale to walk through the land sequence that turned retained earnings into durable equity. She slid forward a county map with colored pins. Red pins were owned ground. Blue pins were acres she operated herself. Yellow pins were acres she leased out under conservative cash rent. The totals explained why neighbors misread her. She farmed 1,140 acres directly, but she owned 2,460 free and clear. The purchases came in windows when she had cash, and others had payment pressure. 2003, she entered a land contract on 320 acres at $1,180 per acre, total $377,600, then accelerated principal and closed it in 2007. 2009, she bought 480 acres from an estate at $1,420 per acre, total $681,600 cash, after liquidating Treasury bills at maturity. 2012, drought discount sale, 600 acres at $1,760 per acre, $1,056,000, funded by 5 years of retained earnings, plus laddered bills. 2017, 900 acres at $1,980 per acre, $1,782,000, paid through a 2-year cash accumulation plan and patronage equity redemption. Total acquisition cost for all owned ground came to $4,065,200. Conservative 2024 valuation at roughly $5,770 per acre put that land near $14.2 million. The machinery math was just as plain. From the 2014 through 2023, her average annual repair, parts, and contracted emergency labor expense was $47,380. Highest year was $62,940. Lowest year was $31,770. Calvin's proposed package, by contrast, carried annual payments of $96,870 before service contracts, and variable interest meant the full cost could rise if rates moved further. Dale had calculated an all-in annual burden near $118,200 once insurance, precision subscription fees, and required service intervals were included. Over 7 years, that package projected to $827,400 under base assumptions. Her own 10-year machinery strategy, even with periodic major repairs, projected $473,800. Difference, $353,600. She circled that figure twice. That is not pride, she told Naomi. That is working capital. Then she flipped to her personal ledger. Average household spending over 5 years, $21,400. No vehicle payment, no revolving balance, no discretionary spending that could not be trimmed in a low-price year. Wealth in her system was not a house size or a truck trim package. It was time and options. When spring turned hot and dry in June, the county split into two financial realities. One reality was visible: newer combines, high-capacity planters, polished semis, and operating lines renewed each year because they had always been renewed before. The other reality was invisible until the first payment stress notices arrived. Mateo Ruiz sat at his own kitchen table 3 miles west of Juniata, lease maps spread between his elbows, trying to save 480 leased acres that had been in his family's rotation for 12 years. Mateo had rolled operating debt to keep acreage through an expensive spring, total $410,000 at 10.9% variable, monthly interest carrying near $3,723 before principal reduction. When corn fell and basis widened, his grain checks no longer covered both input carry and lease commitments. He was not reckless. He was early on fuel contracts, careful with agronomy, and first in line to help neighbors during storm cleanup. His numbers failed because timing failed him. Linda and George Phelps faced a different trap at their dairy northeast of Hastings. They had modernized in 2021 with lender encouragement and a dealer package that made short-term sense when milk prices were higher and borrowing costs were lower. New parlor equipment, feed mixer upgrades, manure handling, and a replacement loader left them with a combined monthly note of $27,400. Feed costs rose, diesel rose, veterinary costs climbed, and milk checks narrowed. Their debt service coverage ratio slipped below covenant levels, then below 1.0. They cut their own wages first. They sold replacement heifers next. They delayed maintenance they knew should not be delayed. By August, they were choosing which bill to pay late each week. Not because they were careless operators, but because fixed outflow outran volatile income. Troy Benning's case was bigger and louder because his expansion had been the county model for aggressive growth. He had pushed to 2,200 acres under a stack of variable loans totaling $3.6 million, secured by land, equipment, and projected yields that looked reasonable when rates were lower and grain stayed elevated. He bought capacity to capture scale. Then rate resets increased annual interest burden by more than $190,000, and collateral values softened just as renewal season tightened. Troy tried to bridge with grain held in storage. Then basis moved against him. He tried to refinance equipment, then lenders asked for additional guarantees he could not provide without selling acres into a down market. He did not gamble, Wes said privately. He followed the playbook that worked for 10 years. Sarah Ivers fought two fronts at once, and that was what broke her operating line. Her equipment note required $14,800 each month, and after a family medical cycle produced bills that insurance did not fully absorb, she began carrying short-term balances that converted into higher-cost debt. She cut labor, reduced acres, and sold calves early to raise cash. It still was not enough. The bank froze her line after she missed covenant metrics by a narrow margin, and an auction date was posted before harvest was finished. Dale read the notice at the courthouse board, copied the parcel numbers into her notebook, and stood there longer than she intended. Not because she wanted more land, because she recognized the look of a good operator, cornered by obligations that did not shrink when weather and price did. 3 weeks later, with drought stress visible in leaf roll by noon and subsoil moisture readings down across the county, The broader market finished what weather had started. Corn that had traded near $6.82 dropped to $4.21. Soybeans fell in sympathy. Short-term renewals printed above 11% for borrowers without exceptional collateral cushions. Input suppliers shortened payment windows. Fuel discounts narrowed. Insurance deductibles rose. In practical terms, each movement stripped flexibility from leveraged operations and punished any budget built on optimistic assumptions. Dale's fields were not immune to heat, but her balance sheet absorbed what weather delivered. She paid $7,220 for the rebuilt combine gearbox and freight from her reserve envelope. She accepted lower yield projections without a lender meeting because no lender held a machinery lane. Her interest expense line remained at zero. That single line became the difference between management and emergency. On the fourth Monday of July, Wes Halbrook called Dale with the outcome of the witness process she had asked for in April. He and Naomi had compiled her cost matrix, verified her source packets, and submitted a recommendation that the county mediation session include producer-generated cost evidence rather than lender templates alone. The request was approved. Dale wrote the date and time on an index card, tucked it into the 2024 box, and returned to the shop where her old combine sat with panels open. She replaced 2 hydraulic hoses cut to length from bulk stock, wrote $184 in parts on masking tape, and stuck it on the inside of the tool cabinet door. Outside, the Silverado looked exactly the way it always looked. Rust at the fenders, twine at the tailgate, dust on the windshield. Inside the farmhouse, the receipts stayed spread on the oak table, line by line, year by year, waiting for the room that had judged her to meet the arithmetic it had ignored. On the fourth Monday of July, an hour after Wes Halbrook called to confirm that mediation would formally admit producer-generated cost evidence, Dale closed the tool cabinet, peeled her gloves off, and walked back to the farmhouse with 2 hydraulic hoses still warm from her hands. The receipts were where she had left them, spread across the oak table in clean rows that turned 4 decades into evidence. She set the hoses by the sink, checked the tabs she had cut from index cards, and labeled the top sheet for mediation. Cost per bushel, 5-year weighted average, source attached. Under that, she clipped land tax histories, treasury statements, cooperative equity notices, and deed copies. She did not add a speech. She added page numbers. At county mediation in Hastings, that same week, the room had already split itself into visible camps before roll call finished. Borrowers sat with lender packets and restructuring requests. Dealers stood near the back wall, arms folded, watching for who might still be financeable. Wes Halbrook and Naomi Laird carried banker boxes to a side table and signed a verification sheet that identified each source packet they had checked line by line. Calvin Russ stood near the coffee station in a crisp vest, listening, saying little, waiting for one more public collapse of an old machine strategy he had already declared obsolete. Dale came in last with a worn coat, faded coveralls, and a legal pad with curled corners. Heads turned toward the coat, then to the boxes, then back to the coat again. The mediator asked for producer evidence first, and Dale stood without ceremony, slid her matrix forward, and began with operating numbers rather than biography. 5-year weighted production cost, $3.38 per bushel. County blended average in the same period, $4.97. Difference, $1.59 per bushel. On her average annual output, that spread represented a margin cushion of $329,893.20 before marketing improvements, annual machinery repair and support expense over 10 years. $44,160 average. Highest, $62,940. Lowest, $31,770. Comparable financed replacement package offered in March. Projected all-in annual burden $100 to $18,200 when payment, required service, insurance, and subscription costs were included. 7-year projected burden, $827,400. Her projected 7-year maintenance path, $309,120. Working capital difference preserved, $518,280. She pushed source receipts forward after each line and waited while the mediator checked signatures from Wes and Naomi. A lender at the end of the table asked the question the room had been circling for months. What liquidity supports this? Dale opened a thin folder, not a thick one, and answered with statement dates. Treasury bills and cash equivalents. $1,940,000 as of March 31st, 2024. Cooperative patronage equities. $612,000 redeemable on schedule. Cash reserve envelopes and operating accounts combined, $388,400 after prepaid inputs and gearbox replacement. Then she set 3 deed abstracts beside the matrix and added the number that changed the room's posture. 2,460 acres, owned free and clear, conservative valuation, approximately $14.2 million at current county comparables. Total net worth, after conservative discounts and excluding sentimental values on machinery, $16.8 million. No one laughed. Chairs shifted. A pen dropped and rolled under a lender chair. Calvin stepped away from the coffee station and asked whether any of the deeded ground was cross-collateralized through private notes. The county title attorney, present for mediation filings, checked the abstract summaries and answered before Dale could. No active liens, no recorded land mortgages, no equipment liens, no judgment attachments. The distinction that had lived quietly in her kitchen for 40 years stood in public now. She did not look rich because she had never spent money to look rich. She had spent money to remove forced decisions from bad years. The mediator, to her credit, did not let the moment turn into spectacle. She asked Dale one practical question: whether her structure had any transfer value for operations already trapped by variable payments. Dale nodded once and passed up a 1-page framework she had drafted in pencil and rewritten in ink the night before. 0 interest carry contracts with clear limits. Budget verification required. Labor plan required. No money for lifestyle upgrades. Funds restricted to operating recovery, essential repairs, and feed or input stabilization. Quarterly ledger reviews at the same table where contracts were signed. Paper tells the truth, she said, not to Calvin, not to the room, just to the page in front of her. Thursday of that same week, the first contract draft went to Mateo Ruiz. Not a rescue fantasy. A bridge with arithmetic. Dale offered seasonal access to 160 acres from her inventory at $4,200 per acre purchase option over a staged timeline for his daughters, Elena and Marisol Ruiz, with market value at the time near $6,100. Total contract value, $672,000 against an appraised value near $976,000, effectively transferring $304,000 of equity if they met operating and savings benchmarks. Down payment required, $33,600. Annual principal schedule, $63,840 for 10 years. Interest, 0. Condition: each daughter had to maintain an emergency reserve equal to at least 6 months of operating costs before any expansion. On the first Tuesday of August, Linda and George Phelps sat at Dale's oak table, hands wrapped around coffee mugs they did not drink. Their dairy numbers were tight, but not hopeless if fixed outflow could be cut fast enough. Dale structured a $120,000 equipment grant, paid directly to retire 2 high-cost notes tied to non-core machinery, with a performance covenant instead of interest. If milk margin over feed costs stayed above the floor for 8 consecutive quarters, no repayment. If margins fell below the floor for 3 consecutive quarters, repayment restarted at $1,250 per month, still zero interest until stabilized. The grant was paired with one hard rule Linda accepted immediately. Herd size would not be rebuilt until debt service ratio stayed above 1.3 for a full year. Pride had no seat at that table. Survival did. 2 days after the Phelps meeting, Sarah Ivers came next, carrying auction paperwork in a folder so worn at the edges it looked fabric. Dale offered a $240,000 operating loan over 10 harvests, zero interest, payments indexed to actual yield, and price bands, so bad crop years did not trigger default cascades. Minimum annual payment, $12,000. Maximum, $36,000 in the strong years. First-year payment allowed to drop to $8,000 if medical bills exceeded a defined threshold verified by statements. Funds were split into controlled disbursements, seed and fertilizer, machinery critical repairs, hired labor support, and insurance continuity. Sarah signed with a steady hand, then cried once, briefly, when she realized she could plan a season instead of just react to notices. Late August, Troy Benning's path required a different design because his collapse had been scale-driven and public. After bankruptcy filings cleared, Dale hired him to manage her grain storage network, salary $92,000 with a profit share formula capped at 15% of annual storage margin, above baseline, no borrowing authority, and full transparency to a 2-signature disbursement policy. He accepted on one condition of his own. He would teach younger operators exactly where leverage had broken his math. Dale agreed. Wes Halbrook formalized the reporting templates, so Troy's rebuild would be measured, not guessed. The man once used as proof that expansion always wins became a living case study in disciplined recovery. When foreclosure auction day arrived in November, wind pushed dust along the lot outside the Hastings sale building, and buyers clustered in small groups around printed parcels. Calvin stood near the machinery sheet, scanning faces for financed bidders he recognized. Dale walked in wearing the same patched coveralls and set 2 cashier checks in a plain envelope on the clerk table before bidding began. The first check, $1,280,000, was designated for the 320-acre parcel that had drawn speculators all month. The second, $286,000, covered a distressed machinery lot that included serviceable units 3 families could use immediately if repaired and allocated correctly. She bid once on the land, once on the lot, and stopped. Both cleared to her at settlement. Calvin did what skeptics do when old assumptions finally crack in public. He called the issuing bank himself. He stepped into the hallway, read the check numbers, and asked for immediate verification. The account officer confirmed settlement capacity on the spot. By the time he returned, the clerk was already stamping transfer documents. Calvin looked at Dale for a long second, then folded his bidder sheet in half and put it in his pocket. He did not argue. He did not smile either. He simply watched the room reprice risk in real time. Dale did not use the microphone until the sale clerk asked whether she wanted to state disposition plans for occupied assets. She spoke for less than a minute. The 320 acres would be split into 2 recovery tracks, with 160 directed to the Ruiz daughters under the zero-interest carry terms filed in August, and 160 retained as rotational support for contract operators who met budget controls. The machinery lot would be refurbished and placed through use agreements priced at documented maintenance cost, plus a reserve contribution, not market extraction. No one applauded at first because they were still doing the numbers. Then Naomi Laird, from the back, started the only response that mattered. She asked where operators could submit budgets for review. From December through early spring 2025, Dale and Naomi held 12 kitchen table sessions with applicants who brought ledgers, tax returns, labor plans, and realistic yield assumptions. 5 were approved under Caldwell Working Farm Fund criteria after Dale seeded the fund with $2,500,000 and set a maximum borrower rate cap tied to Treasury yields plus 1.2%, never exceeding 4.5% in the initial charter years. Administrative costs were capped at 1.1% of assets, audited annually by an outside firm in Hastings. By design, the fund did not chase volume. It chased durability. The deeper math, once assembled, explained why her method could help more than one household without destabilizing her own operation. Starting liquid reserves after the November purchases and commitments fell from $1,940,000 to $254,000. But Treasury maturities in the next 12 months added $620,000. Projected retained farm earnings under conservative pricing added $402,000, and lease income on non-operated acres added $318,000. Expected inflow, $1,340,000. Expected outflow for support programs and operations, $1,112,000. Projected year-end liquidity, $482,000 without borrowing. Land holdings remained unencumbered at 2,780 acres, with conservative valuation near $15.9 million after applying a 10% stress discount. Net worth moved from $16.8 million to approximately $17.9 million on paper after grants and below-market transfers, then stabilized as recipient repayments and operating margins flowed back through structured channels. The recipient trajectories were tracked the same way Dale tracked hydraulic hoses and tax stubs. Mateo's family met reserve targets in year 1 and posted positive retained earnings in year 2, despite below-trend rainfall. Linda and George Phelps cut fixed outflow enough to restore covenant compliance and reopened their dairy on a smaller, profitable footprint with monthly note pressure reduced by more than $6,000. Sarah Ivers returned to positive cash flow in her second year and made a voluntary payment above minimum after a stronger corn season. Troy Benning's storage network reporting turned profitable by quarter 3, and his profit share was paid in full only after reserve targets were met. Arithmetic first. Dignity intact. No one was asked to pretend pain had not happened. They were asked to build a structure that could survive the next cycle. By late spring, Calvin Rusk had closed his high-leverage sales model and reopened as a used equipment broker with transparent total cost sheets that listed purchase price, expected repairs, financing exposure, and 5-year ownership estimates side by side. He told Wes quietly that he had spent years selling monthly payments and calling it strategy. Dale's receipts, spread on one kitchen table, had forced him to look at lifetime cost as the only number that does not flinch when weather turns. Wes did not answer Calvin right away. He wrote the sentence down on the back of a feed invoice, folded it once, and put it in his shirt pocket because he knew he would use it later in the workshop binder. By the second week of June 2025, the first full quarter of Caldwell Working Farm Fund reports came in, and the numbers showed what verbal promises never could. Mateo Ruiz and his daughters were the first file in Naomi Laird's stack. Elena Ruiz handled crop planning, Marisol Ruiz handled books, and Mateo moved into a support role exactly as the contract required. On the 160-acre purchase track at $4,200 per acre, they made the scheduled principal payment of $63,840 on time, added $11,260 extra from a post-harvest basis improvement, and still finished the year with a 6-month operating reserve of $96,400, above the covenant threshold by $14,700. Their corn yield came in at 176 bushels per acre during a dry year, soybeans at 54, and they locked fertilizer early through a capped cost co-op program that cut spring input exposure by 8.2%. In year 2, they added a modest custom hay operation that produced $38,600 gross and $14,980 retained after fuel, twine, and maintenance. No flashy jump, just controlled growth. Linda and George Phelps had the second file, thicker and more emotional, because dairy recovery is daily arithmetic and daily fatigue. The $120,000 grant Dale issued had retired 2 high-cost notes, but survival still depended on execution. Linda cut herd count from 210 to 164 milking head, raised feed conversion efficiency through ration changes Naomi helped model, and signed a fixed-rate electricity contract that reduced monthly utility variance by almost $1,100. George rebuilt 2 parlor pumps himself with $3,420 in parts, instead of replacing both units at $18,700 financed. Their monthly fixed outflow dropped from $27,400 to $20,980 within 6 months, then to $19,860 after lease renegotiation on a non-core loader. By spring 2026, their debt service coverage ratio held at 1.36 for 4 consecutive quarters. They met the covenant, kept the grant non-repayable, and rehired 1 part-time worker they had previously let go. Their daughter, Claire Phelps, returned from Lincoln on weekends to manage calf records and eventually took a paid operations role with a written wage, not a family handshake. Sarah Ivers's file had fewer pages than people expected because her structure was intentionally simple. The $240,000 zero-interest operating loan was split into controlled draws and audited against invoices each quarter. She used $82,000 for seed and fertilizer, $41,300 for essential equipment repairs, $36,700 for labor continuity, and the balance for insurance and carry expenses. Her first-year payment, reduced under the medical threshold clause, came in at $8,000 exactly. In year 2, stronger yields and disciplined marketing lifted retained earnings enough that she paid $29,400, well above minimum, while keeping $74,200 in emergency liquidity. She also wrote 1 line on her annual review sheet that Wes later read aloud with her permission. "Stability is what lets me be a good farmer again." Troy Benning's trajectory was slower because rebuilding after a public collapse requires both math and humility. As storage network manager, he reduced spoilage losses from 1.8% to 0.9% by tightening aeration schedules and standardizing moisture thresholds at intake. He renegotiated rail timing penalties with 2 buyers lowering annual logistics drag by $47,000 across the network. His baseline salary stayed at $92,000, and in the first profit share year, he earned an additional $18,600 after reserves cleared target. In the second year, he earned $31,200 and put $24,000 into his own treasury ladder under a voluntary plan Dale insisted he adopt before discussing any future land lease. He began teaching one evening module at the kitchen table workshops titled Expansion Math Under Stress Assumptions. People attended because he had lived both sides of the equation. Before we go any further, if you are watching this story for the practical side, pay attention to what happens next, because the multiplier is the part most people miss until the paperwork is complete. By autumn 2026, Dale and Naomi could quantify the second-order impact of those first contracts. The Ruiz acreage stabilized one family and kept local custom work in county hands. The Phelps Dairy resumed buying feed from two nearby growers who had lost that account during downsizing. Sarah's recovered operation restored seasonal labor hours that had vanished during her auction cycle. Troy's storage improvements raised net receipts for 12 unaffiliated producers using the bins under published rates. Add those channels together, and one woman's zero-debt discipline began circulating through payrolls, feed orders, repair invoices, and rent checks far beyond her own fields. The arithmetic was plain. Direct support commitments from Dale over the first 18 months totaled $3,146,000 when grants, below-market land transfer value, operating loans, machinery rehabilitation, and fund seed capital were combined. By the end of that period, documented retained earnings and equity gains among recipient households and associated operators reached $5,482,300. That was not charity multiplication by sentiment. It was structural multiplication through lower fixed outflow and better timing options. 12 linked operations controlled or operated 3,980 acres with healthier balance sheets than before intervention. Conservative land value attached to those acres stood near $24.1 million. The community impact did not come from one dramatic check. It came from repeatable rules. Calvin Rusk's resolution unfolded without ceremony, which suited the county better than spectacle. He kept the brokerage open, sold fewer units, and published full ownership sheets that included purchase price, expected parts, likely downtime, financing cost bands, and 5-year total burden. In his old model, gross commissions were larger because finance packages were larger. In the new model, commissions shrank per transaction, but default-linked reputational damage also shrank. His first full year as a used equipment broker produced $412,000 in gross commissions, down from peak dealership years. Yet his overhead fell sharply after closing the high-pressure sales floor and ending incentive bonuses tied to loan volume. Net income settled at $173,000, steady and less volatile. More important, his client delinquency spillover exposure, once a constant background risk, dropped near zero because he no longer built his business on variable rate optimism. He made one additional choice people noticed. At winter producer meetings, he stopped using urgency language and started using scenario sheets. He would show 3 columns now: good year, average year, stress year. If the stress year did not work, he told people to wait. Older farmers in the back rows watched him closely the first few times, expecting a return to old habits. It did not happen. By early 2027, even skeptical borrowers admitted his quotes had become harder to sign quickly and easier to live with later. He and Dale never became friends in any theatrical sense, but they reached a practical détente built on documentation. Once, at the co-op lot, he handed her a parts sheet and said, "I was late learning." She answered, "You learned." That was all. Let me stop here and ask you something. When you make big money decisions, do you test them against your worst year or your best year? That single choice writes most endings long before the ending arrives. The roll call by then mattered, because every named person in this county story had earned more than a passing mention. Wes Hallbrook stayed at Prairie Valley Cooperative, added producer-led stress testing templates to annual planning packets, and required side-by-side lifetime cost sheets for any equipment discussion hosted in co-op space. Naomi Laird remained with Extension Services and formalized the kitchen table curriculum into a 12-session program covering cost per bushel analysis, reserve design, and covenant literacy. Claire Phelps became operations manager at her family dairy with a written succession plan and quarterly salary reviews. Elena Ruiz took over agronomy decisions for the Ruiz ground and completed a farm finance certificate through night classes. Marisol Ruiz built a clean bookkeeping system that passed 2 consecutive outside audits with no material corrections. Sarah Ivers added 30 leased acres only after reserve targets were met and paid year 3 loan obligations without clause relief. Troy Benning never returned to leverage-led expansion and told every class the same line: "Scale does not save bad structure." Dale remained exactly where most people first saw her, which was the point. Same 2-bedroom farmhouse bought in 1986 for $62,000. Same oak table with the canner burn mark from 1997. Same 1989 Silverado, now at 327,400 miles, still with rusted fenders, though the tailgate twine had finally been replaced by a salvaged latch Troy installed for $46 in parts and 1 evening of labor. Her clothing stayed practical. Her routines stayed narrow. Spring seed invoices still went into dated envelopes. Land tax stubs still got hole-punched and filed by parcel. She farmed her 1,140 acres, leased selected tracts under written budget requirements, and chaired the Caldwell Working Farm Fund only long enough to protect its rules from drift. The fund itself had its own continuity safeguards by 2027. Assets under management grew from the original $2,500,000 to $3,180,000 through repayments, low-risk yield, and capped administrative expense. Default rate remained 0 across the first cohort. Not because every season was generous, but because underwriting emphasized discipline over acreage ambition. Maximum rate in any issued loan remained below 4.5%, exactly as chartered. Every borrower submitted quarterly ledgers. Every variance had to be explained in writing. The process was plain, sometimes uncomfortable, and extremely effective. If you are learning something from this, share it with one person who still thinks a bigger payment is the same thing as a bigger farm. There was one more resolution that belonged in the ledger. Harold Vetter, long gone, had once told a young Dale to pay when she could. In October 2027, Dale met Harold's granddaughter, Nina Vetter, at the same kitchen table and funded a $60,000 beginning operator line through the fund under standard rules, no favoritism, fully document. Nina signed, looked at Harold's old receipt copy framed near the pantry door, and cried quietly for a moment before composing herself. Legacy in this county was rarely loud. It was usually paper moving from one steady hand to another. And now the thesis had nowhere left to hide. The woman in faded coveralls, driving the rusted truck, was not hanging on by luck. She had been building solvency in plain sight for 40 years. one receipt at a time, while everyone else watched paint, chrome, and monthly payment offers. Appearance had pointed one direction. Arithmetic had pointed the other. Arithmetic won. For more stories like this, subscribe so you do not miss the next county where quiet discipline rewrites the outcome. In the comments, tell me the one cost category you would audit first if you spread your own receipts across a table tonight. Then share this with the person in your life who is working hard, living modestly, and being underestimated because their wealth does not announce itself. After everyone left that evening, Dale stood alone in her kitchen, squared one stack of envelopes by year, turned off the overhead light, and let the porch bulb shine over the old Silverado in the yard, rusted, paid for, and ready for morning. The porch bulb stayed on for another minute after Dale shut the kitchen light. Then she stepped back inside, turned it on again, and pulled one banker box from the 1988 through 1991 stack onto the oak table. The wind had picked up, and the old window above the sink gave a soft rattle she had heard for decades. She opened a fresh envelope, wrote Workshop Archive on the front, and slid in 3 documents she had used that week. The mediation verification sheet, signed by Wes Halbrook and Naomi Laird, a copy of the November cashier check settlement, and the first-page summary of the Caldwell Working Farm Fund Charter. Then she took Calvin Rusk's original glossy quote from March 2024, the one with $96,870 annual payments at 8.4% variable, folded it in thirds, and filed it behind the 2024 tab. She did not keep it as a grudge. She kept it as a benchmark. By the first Thursday of February 2028, the kitchen table workshop had outgrown the room twice over, yet Dale kept it at the same table anyway. 16 chairs, 4 stools, and 3 people standing by the pantry door. The coffee was strong, the furnace kicked every 10 minutes, and the canner burn mark from 1997 sat in the center of the table under a clear vinyl sheet Naomi had cut to protect old wood from new paperwork. Mateo Ruiz arrived first with Elena and Marisol, each carrying binders with color tabs. Sarah Ivers came next with a ledger and a shoebox of receipts she apologized for before sitting down. Linda and George Phelps came in from the cold with Claire, who had 2 printouts and a laptop closed under her arm. Troy Benning took the far chair near the wall map. Wes stood by the coat rack with attendance forms. Dale began exactly the way she had in mediation. Source behind every line, she said, and nodded to Mateo. Helena opened their binder to the year-end page. Gross crop revenue on their 160-acre contract ground, $212,480. Total operating cost, including labor draw, fuel, repairs, and reserve contributions, $149,220. Retained earnings, $63,260. Scheduled principal paid, $63,840. Additional principal paid, $18,000 after a favorable soybean basis. Emergency reserve balance at year-end, $118,900, equal to just over 7 months of core operating expense. Marisol read each number, then passed copies down both sides of the table. Mateo did not speak until the end. "We sleep now," he said, looking at Dale, then at his daughters. Sarah's update was quieter and just as solid. She had entered year 4 of the 10-harvest, zero-interest structure. Her minimum required payment for the year had been $12,000. She paid $31,600 because yields were stronger, and she had forward-priced enough corn to avoid a late-season cash squeeze. Operating line usage fell from crisis levels to a controlled seasonal draw, then back to zero after harvest settlements. Her emergency liquidity, once almost gone, stood at $102,400. She handed Dale one envelope and said, "This is the auction notice from before. I wanted it out of my house." Dale opened the envelope, looked at the courthouse stamp, and filed it behind Sarah's current payment receipt. Physical evidence moved from fear file to history file. Accounted for. Claire led the Phelps review while George watched the numbers and Linda watched Claire. Monthly fixed outflow on the dairy had stabilized at $19,420, down from $27,400 at the worst point. Milk margin over feed had held above covenant floor for 10 straight quarters. Debt service coverage ratio came in at 1.41 for the year. They had replaced one failing compressor with a rebuilt unit for $4,960 cash, instead of financing new at more than triple the total cost over term. They hired one full-time worker and one seasonal part-time worker, both with written wages and payroll tax withholding handled correctly, something Linda said she wished they had done years earlier. The $120,000 grant remained non-repayable by terms met. George slid a check for $15,000 across to the fund anyway. "Not required," he said, "but right." Dale pushed it back once. George pushed it forward again. Dale accepted and wrote "gift, unrestricted, Phelps Dairy" on the receipt line. When it was Troy's turn, he stood and taped 2 sheets to the wall map. Sheet 1 showed grain storage performance under his management. Spoilage down to 0.7%, net storage margin up $86,000 over baseline, reserve targets met for 6 consecutive quarters. Sheet 2 showed 12 unaffiliated operators using the storage network under transparent rates, with combined net gain from lower shrink and fewer penalties at $214,300 for the year. He pointed to the stress year column he now required in every estimate, and looked straight at 2 younger growers in clean jackets by the doorway. "Run this column first," he said. "If this column fails, the deal fails." No one in that room treated him as a cautionary tale anymore. They treated him as tested data. Naomi took the floor after lunch and built the multiplier in chalk on a black board Dale had salvaged from a school auction years earlier. Direct commitments from Dale and the fund since launch, adjusted through year-end 2027, $3,206,000. Verified retained earnings and equity improvement among supported households and linked operations, $6,148,700. Ratio, 1.92 to 1. Then she added secondary effects, documented through payroll, local repair invoices, feed contracts, and lease stability, $2,011,400. Combined local impact, $8,160,100 from the same base commitment. Wes read out the external report outcome from County Extension, the one generated from his original call and Naomi's verification process in 2024. Producer-led stress testing was now formal guidance in 3 neighboring counties. That call had not vanished into a file. It had become policy. Calvin arrived late, carrying a cardboard tube and a box of donuts no one had asked him to bring. The room went quiet for a moment, then Dale pointed to an empty chair without introducing him. He unrolled a sample equipment sheet on the table beside the old burn mark. Purchase price, expected parts, labor hours, financing exposure at 3 rate scenarios, and 5-year ownership total in large print. He had added one line in red, break-even yield required under stress year pricing. "I should have used this years ago," he said. "I was selling payments, not outcomes." Linda studied the sheet for a long time, then nodded once. Calvin's fate had already been visible in his business filings, But this was the part that settled it in community terms. He had closed the leverage first model, rebuilt as a used equipment broker, and changed what he put in front of farmers before they signed. 3 days later, Calvin met Dale at Prairie Valley Cooperative by the bulk oil tank where he had once pitched urgency in a loud voice. Wes was there, checking delivery manifests, and Naomi was taking photos of posted cost templates for a regional training packet. Calvin handed Dale a slim folder. Inside was his first full-year brokerage statement and a one-page letter addressed to the fund board offering pro bono total cost reviews for first-generation borrowers. "No commissions on those files," he said. Dale read it, closed the folder, and gave it to Wes for the next board agenda. Then she said, "Paper tells the truth. Keep writing better paper." Calvin agreed, and this time the agreement was not performance, it was operating policy. By harvest 2029, every named life in this story had a present tense that could be verified. Dale still farmed 1,140 acres and still owned her ground, free and clear. The Silverado crossed 334,000 miles, rust unchanged, with Troy's salvaged latch still holding the tailgate square. Her patched coat zipper still ran on the brass keyring, and she still wrote repair costs on masking tape above the workbench before entering them in ledgers at night. Mateo had shifted to mentoring while Elena and Marisol ran field and finance decisions jointly, with reserves above target and no expansion without cash coverage. Sarah had completed 5 of 10 harvest payments and carried no delinquent obligations. Linda and George had moved to a right-sized dairy that paid people on time and slept better at night. Claire held formal authority in writing, not rumor. Troy continued as storage manager, taught stress testing each winter, and never borrowed against projected optimism again. Wes remained the practical bridge between pride and paperwork. Naomi expanded the curriculum across county lines and kept Dale's original matrix, laminated now in every class binder. Nina Vetter completed her second operating cycle under standard fund terms and made both scheduled payments without exception, closing one circle Harold had opened with a simple sentence decades earlier. Dale also closed one administrative loop that had sat open since the beginning. She and Naomi spent a full Saturday in the spare room, reviewed all 19 banker boxes, and logged each physical item to final category: permanent archive, educational copy, or redundant duplicate for secure shredding. The red-taped combine failure tag from 2024 went into a shadow box by the workshop board. The legal pad from the March co-op meeting, coffee stain and all, was scanned and filed. The courthouse notices, mediation packets, bank verification copies, and settlement receipts were indexed by date and cross-referenced to outcomes. Nothing meaningful stayed loose. Nothing unresolved stayed unnamed. On a clear morning in March 2030, 6 years after the day people in polished pickups watched her park by the propane cage, Dale left the farmhouse before sunrise and stood by the Silverado while the engine warmed. Frost sat white on the hood. The porch bulb clicked off behind her as daylight came up over the bin she had paid for in cash and the field she had never mortgaged away. She put one more envelope on the passenger seat, labeled 2030, blank except for the date. Then she drove out to check a tile outlet before breakfast. Same route, same gravel, same steady speed. That is how the story ends in Adams County. Not with revenge, not with a speech, and not with a lifestyle reveal. A woman who looked poor kept records long enough for reality to catch up with appearance. Good people who had been trapped by fixed payments, rebuilt through structures that respected bad years. A dealer who once dismissed caution rewrote his business around total cost. A county that mistook chrome for solvency learned to read ledgers before logos. The old truck stayed old. The table stayed scarred. The receipts kept stacking. And every spring after that, when someone new sat down at Dale Caldwell's kitchen and asked where to start, she slid a blank sheet across the table and answered the same way. Write the stress year first.